So I recently finished Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee, the sequel To Kill a Mockingbird, her Pulitzer Prize winning classic. Oh dear. We'll get into it. This was so hard to read, and also just so hard now to even talk about it, because it doesn't feel real. Like, this, first of all, this never needed a sequel, and I don't think the plan was for this to ever receive a sequel. To my knowledge, this was written first, and publishers rejected it, rightly so. It's rough. But even so, from what I've heard, and, take it with a enormous grain of salt, but I have heard whisperings that she was very much put under pressure to release this, because it had been like almost 60 years since the first one had come out, and so publishers thought this will be like a huge marketing deal if we can get her to send out the original book, because this one was written before, even though it takes place years later. It's weird. It's very weird. You almost have to treat this, instead of a book, as almost like a historical artifact. Like, all of the marketing for Go Set a Watchman is like, oh, it really informs you about To Kill a Mockingbird. And it does, but not in a way that is at all flattering. Because this was so bad, not only in how it's written, the storytelling is bad, the characterization is bad, the messaging, more than anything, actively harmful. Like, so destructive to the civil rights movement and to, conversations about race in general, especially in America, that it retroactively makes me look at this book and feel less about this book because of how damaging Harper Lee's views are in this one. Like, what's going on here? So if you're not familiar with To Kill a Mockingbird, it is lightning in a bottle. It's an incredibly crafted book. Every single thing in it is necessary. Like, there's no space that's not taken up in a meaningful way. Like, you can see why it's studied in schools. Admittedly, yes, it's a very white-centric view of race, but I can't really comment on that either, because I am also white, in case you didn't notice. So for my POV at least, perfectly great book, and I've always enjoyed it. But then this book comes along, and okay, Jean Louise Finch, who was only a little girl in the first one, she's now 26. She's going back to the town of Macomb, where the first one was set, to visit her father, Atticus, the lawyer. He's now 72. He's now arthritic. But most shockingly, he is a belligerent racist, even though in the first book, he, at least to our perception, or at least to mine, was a perfectly lovely man who was like a source for good. He was defending Tom Robinson from like these false accusations. Like, I don't know, it's been a few years since I've read the first book, but I always saw Atticus as the good guy, so it's a character assassination, to say the least, that in this sequel, he all of a sudden is like hateable. Like, he's so bigoted, so like horrible, the things that he comes out with. And even Jean Louise, who is supposed to be the liberal in the room, the one who is supposed to be arguing for the like desegregation of black and white people as they like head into the 60s, she also is like, oh yeah, well, I agree that black people are biologically and socially inferior. It's like, oh, yikes. Big yikesies. Truly, this whole book can be summarised as like Jean Louise Finch goes back to see her dad. They have a disagreement about black people. She gets angry, but then apologises because family, I guess. Like, it's okay to spend time with your relatives even if they're nasty bigots, just because, hey, family. Like, what? What was this trying to tell me? It really jumps out at you that this was written years later, because you can see that Harper Lee, her mindset around the way black and white people should interact and equality, like, you can see the shift in her mind and how that affects the way that this is written and why this then becomes a better book. But then, because we don't have any other work from her, it then is this elephant in the room where you're like, okay, but did you fully change your mindset, or are these two like just a before and after? Like, it's such a weird place for me now. Like, I look at this has such a taint over it now where I just feel like I can't enjoy it as much as I used to. Like, when I tell you that most of this book is meaningless flashbacks that go nowhere, like, there's so many childhood moments where Jean Louise is playing with Jem, who in this is dead. We don't really get an explanation of how he died. He just is. He's dead. Dill, their like friend in Italy or somewhere like that. Again, no real explanation, just completely out of the novel. And it's just why. Like, the first book is so watertight. There's no pages are wasted. This, there's one memorable scene in the whole thing, the disagreement that they have, and then just when you think, oh, Jean Louise is going to leave because she's better than all of them, like she's not a horribly racist southerner, she then gets physically abused by her uncle and is like, oh, well, you know what? Family does matter. And then rescinds all of her beliefs just to be placated by her family. Like, what? What is this trying to tell me? Like, even Jean Louise arrives on, like, oh, yeah, well, white people are superior. Like, oh, I think black people should be treated better, but I would never have a interracial relationship with them. Like, of course, why would I do that? Like, oh, oh no, 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 no. How did so many people had to approve this coming out, you know? Like, so many people were okay with this being published, and that's crazy to me, because it, not only was it not that long ago, but I think it's fairly clear that Harper Lee probably never wanted this to see the light of day, because there's such a transformation between the two of them, and it's like, oh, whose idea was this? Who said, oh yeah, this can be greenlit? Like, what? Wow. Nuts. And then, of course, I fell down the rabbit hole of all the different conspiracy theories, you know, people who speculated that Truman Capote wrote the To Kill a Mockingbird book, which, I mean, I don't want to indulge it too much because it's not really fair when they're both dead and, like, she can't defend herself. But I think the claims were debunked. I had no idea that they were childhood friends growing up and that the character of Dill is actually based on Truman Capote. But that is fascinating to think about, like, is this someone else and then this is actually her? It's just there's so many conflicting beliefs across the two that I feel like something must have happened. Like, what was the catalyst for her belief system to change so much between the two books? Or is it just that there's so much more subterfuge in this that you have to read something like this to really appreciate her mindset around race? Like, it's troubling for me. Like, as I said, I can never look at this the same way now. It's fully like how Wide Sargasso Sea makes you look at Jane Eyre differently, but at least that's because it's a retelling by different people. This is the same woman, just 60 years apart, and oof, no, it's a no from me. Fully, don't read this. Just don't.